The sirens began at 12:20 a.m. on August 26, 1940, their wail cutting through the summer darkness over Berlin. In apartments across the Reich capital, Germans sat up in bed confused. Air raid sirens here. Many thought it was a drill. It had to be a drill. Hermann Göring himself had promised them repeatedly with absolute certainty. No enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. If an enemy aircraft reaches the roar Göring had declared the previous year, his chest laden with medals, his face flushed with confidence. My name is not Hermann Göring. You can call me Maya, a common German surname. Yes, but also, and this was the joke, the ultimate humiliation, a stereotypically Jewish name. For the Reichsmarshal of the Third Reich to say, call me Maya, was to stake his entire reputation, his honor, his Nazi credentials on the Luftwaffe's invincibility. And he'd said it not once but many times in various forms about the Ruhr, about German cities, about Berlin itself. The German people had believed him. Why wouldn't they? The Luftwaffe had swept across Poland, demolished the Dutch and Belgian air forces, brought France to its knees. German air superiority was a fact as solid as the concrete of the new Reich Chancellery. But now the sirens were screaming and searchlights were stabbing up into the darkness, and somewhere above the clouds, British bombers were approaching the capital of the thousand-year Reich. The promise had been made from a position of absolute confidence. In the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, Germany seemed unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Western Europe in a matter of weeks. Only Britain remained isolated, seemingly helpless. Hitler had expected the British to negotiate, to accept reality, to acknowledge German dominance. Instead, Churchill had refused. We shall never surrender, he told Parliament. The words seemed brave but hollow. What could Britain actually do? The answer, Hitler and Göring decided, was to destroy the Royal Air Force, achieve air superiority over the English Channel, and prepare for invasion. Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious assault on Britain, required control of the skies. The Luftwaffe, with over 2,600 aircraft available, faced RAF Fighter Command with perhaps 700 operational fighters. The mathematics seemed clear. Göring assured Hitler it would take 4 days to destroy the RAF in southern England, 4 weeks to eliminate the entire force. The assault began in earnest in mid-July 1940. German bombers escorted by fighters attacked British shipping coastal targets, then RAF airfields. The strategy was sound. Destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air, wreck their infrastructure, make Britain defenseless, and it was working. Through late July and August, RAF Fighter Command was being ground down. Pilots were flying 4-5 sorties a day, landing with hands shaking from exhaustion, climbing back into cockpits before the aircraft had cooled. Airfields were being cratered by bombs. Radar stations were damaged. Fighter production couldn't keep up with losses. Hugh Downing, commanding Fighter Command, was watching his force bleed to death. But Hitler had given strict orders. Do not bomb London, not yet. He wanted to preserve the option of negotiation, avoid provoking British retaliation against German cities, maintain the moral high ground. The Luftwaffe was to focus on military targets, airfields, factories, ports. London, the great civilian center, was off limits. On the night of August 24, 1940, that order was accidentally violated. German bombers, perhaps lost, perhaps confused by darkness and British defenses, dropped bombs on central London. The damage was limited, but the symbolism was enormous. British civilians had been killed in the capital. Churchill, who had been waiting for such a moment, immediately ordered retaliation, not against military targets, against Berlin. The RAF had been conducting small raids against German targets for months, industrial sites, transportation hubs, military installations, but Berlin had remained untouched, too distant for most British bombers, too well defended, too symbolic. Now Churchill ordered Bomber Command to reach the German capital, regardless of cost. If the Germans would bomb London, the British would bomb Berlin. The strategic value was questionable. The RAF's twin-engine bombers would struggle to reach Berlin with meaningful bomb loads, but the psychological value was immense. On the night of August 25, 81 RAF bombers took off from bases in England, heading east across the North Sea. Most were Wellingtons and Hamptons, sturdy but slow, carrying perhaps 1,000 lb of bombs each. The distance was extreme, the navigation challenging, the defenses unknown. Many turned back with mechanical problems or lost their way. But 29 aircraft reached Berlin. Hildegard K.F., a young woman who would later become a famous actress, was in her apartment when the sirens began. She'd been asleep. The sound was unreal, impossible. She went to the window and saw searchlights sweeping the sky, heard the distant thump of anti-aircraft guns, then unmistakably the crump of explosions, not close but close enough. Somewhere in Berlin, British bombs were falling. The raid lasted about an hour. The bombs scattered across the city hit residential areas in the northern and eastern districts, a railway line, a dairy. The damage was minimal. No one was killed in this first raid, but the psychological impact was devastating. Germans emerged from shelters confused, angry, disbelieving. How had this happened? Where was the Luftwaffe? Where were the promised defenses? William Shirer, the American journalist stationed in Berlin, noted the reaction in his diary. The Berliners are stunned. They did not think it could happen. He watched people gathering in the streets the next morning, staring at the damage, speaking in low voices. The official propaganda machine controlled by Joseph Goebbels immediately went to work minimizing the raid. The damage was insignificant, they said. Only a few bombs, no military targets hit. The British were wasting their effort, but Goebbels couldn't hide the central fact. British bombers had reached Berlin. Göring's promise was broken. The Reich's marshal himself was not in Berlin. He was at his estate Karenhau north of the city, surrounded by his looted art collection and pet lions. When informed of the raid, he reportedly raged, blamed the Luftwaffe's fighter command, demanded explanations, but the explanation was simple. Berlin was at the extreme range of British bombers, yes, but not impossible to reach. The city's defenses, while substantial, were not impenetrable, and the RAF, desperate and determined, was willing to accept heavy losses to strike back. The British came again on August 28. This time they hit the city center. A bomb landed near the Brandenburg Gate. Another struck close to the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's headquarters. The Führer was not present, but the symbolism was clear. The British could strike at the heart of the Reich. More raids followed on August 31, September 1st, September 3rd. Each time the damage was relatively light. The RAF simply couldn't deliver massive bomb loads at that range, but each raid was a humiliation, a contradiction of everything the German people had been told. Hitler, who had been at the Berghof in Bavaria when the first raids occurred, returned to Berlin in early September. He was, according to those who saw him, in a state of cold fury. The British had bombed his capital. They had humiliated Göring. They had made him look weak, and they had done it deliberately, knowing it would provoke him, daring him to respond. On September 4, 1940, Hitler spoke at the Sportpalast in Berlin. The audience was primarily women, nurses, social workers, party functionaries. The speech was broadcast across Germany. Hitler's voice, initially controlled, rose to a shriek as he addressed the British raids. When the British Air Force drops 2 or 3 or 4,000 kg of bombs, then we will in one night drop 150, 230, 300 or 400,000 kg. The crowd roared approval. Hitler continued, his voice cracking with rage. When they declare that they will increase their attacks on our cities, then we will raise their cities to the ground. The audience erupted. Women wept, shouted, raised their arms in salute. Hitler fed on their energy, his voice rising higher. We will stop the handiwork of these night air pirates. So help us God, the hour will come when one of us will break, and it will not be National Socialist Germany. The crowd chanted, Führer befolgen, Führer command we follow. Hitler's decision was made. He would erase British cities, he would make them pay for their insolence, and he would start with London. Albert Kessler, the Luftwaffe Field Marshal commanding air operations in the West, received the order on September 5. The directive was clear: cease attacks on RAF airfields, shift all available bomber forces to London, begin sustained terror bombing of the British capital. The goal was no longer to destroy fighter command's infrastructure. It was to break British civilian morale, to create such chaos and suffering that Churchill's government would collapse. Kessler, a professional soldier, understood the strategic implications immediately. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had been systematically destroying RAF fighter command. The British were on the ropes. Several key airfields in southern England were nearly non-operational. Dowing's pilot losses were unsustainable. Fighter command was perhaps 2 weeks from collapse. If the pressure continued, if the Luftwaffe kept hammering the airfields, Britain's air defense would crumble. And without air defense, invasion became possible. But Kesselring was a soldier in a dictatorship. Hitler had given an order. Göring, desperate to restore his reputation, enthusiastically supported it. The Luftwaffe would bomb London. On September 7, 1940, in late afternoon, Londoners heard a sound unlike anything they'd experienced before. A deep rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Over 300 German bombers escorted by 600 fighters approached the city in broad daylight. The formations darkened the sky. RAF fighters rose to meet them, but the sheer scale was overwhelming. The bombers reached London's East End, the docks, the warehouses, the densely packed working-class neighborhoods. The bombs fell in waves, high explosives and incendiaries. The docks erupted in flames. Fire spread through streets of wooden houses. By nightfall, much of East London was burning, the flames visible for miles, a beacon for the next wave of bombers that arrived after dark. The raid continued all night. Over 400 Londoners died. Thousands were injured. Tens of thousands were made homeless. The Blitz had begun. For the next 57 consecutive nights, German bombers would attack London. Other British cities would follow: Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester. The bombing would kill over 40,000 British civilians before it finally ended in May 1941. The devastation was real, the suffering immense. But RAF Fighter Command, given breathing room by the shift away from their airfields, survived. Damaged bases were repaired. New pilots completed training. Aircraft production continued. And the Luftwaffe, focused on terror bombing instead of strategic targeting, was wasting its strength. Bombing cities at night was far less effective than destroying military infrastructure in daylight. The loss rates were similar, but the strategic return was minimal. Hugh Dowing, exhausted and under criticism for his defensive tactics, would be removed from command in November 1940. But his strategy had worked. Fighter command had held. By late September, it was clear that Germany would not achieve air superiority over Britain. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, then quietly abandoned. The invasion would never happen. The Battle of Britain was over. Britain had won. not through superior numbers or better equipment but by surviving long enough for Hitler to make a mistake. And the mistake had been triggered by Hermann Göring's promise, by German pride, by the need to respond to British bombs on Berlin. In the months that followed, as the Blitz continued, but the strategic situation stabilized, German military leaders began to understand what had happened. The shift to terror bombing had been an emotional decision, not a strategic one. Hitler had let his rage override military logic. Göring had supported it to save face, and the Luftwaffe had paid the price. Kessler, in his post-war memoir, was diplomatic but clear. The decision to switch targets had been a mistake. The RAF had been on the verge of collapse. "We had them," one Luftwaffe officer said years later, "and then we let them go." Göring, for his part, never publicly acknowledged the failure of his promise. He blamed the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots for not protecting the bombers, blamed British luck, blamed everything except his own arrogance. But privately his influence with Hitler began to wane. The Reich Marshal who had promised that no bomb would fall on Berlin had been proven wrong. And in the Third Reich, being proven wrong by the Führer's enemies was unforgivable. The German public, for their part, learned to live with the air raids. Berlin would be bombed again and again as the war progressed with increasing intensity. By 1943, RAF Bomber Command and the US 8 Air Force would be dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German cities in single raids, making those first small raids of August 1940 seem almost quaint. Germans would learn to sleep in shelters, to navigate ruined streets, to live with constant fear. The promise of invulnerability was forgotten or remembered only as a bitter joke. "Call me," Göring had said. By the end of the war, with German cities in ruins and the Luftwaffe destroyed, some Germans did call him that quietly, bitterly, a reminder of the hubris that had helped cost them everything. The irony was perfect and terrible. Hitler had ordered the bombing of London to avenge the bombing of Berlin, to restore German pride, to punish British insolence. But that decision made in rage had saved Britain's air force and lost Germany its best chance to invade. The bombs that fell on Berlin in August 1940, scattered, ineffective, barely damaging, had triggered a chain of events that changed the course of the war. Churchill understood this. In his post-war history of the war, he wrote about the German shift to London with barely concealed satisfaction. The RAF had been in desperate straits, he acknowledged, but Hitler's decision to switch targets was a turning point in the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe had abandoned the strategy that was working for one that merely looked dramatic. And it had all started with a promise made with absolute confidence by a man in a ridiculous uniform covered in medals who swore that British bombs would never fall on German soil. The promise had been broken on August 26, 1940, when 29 RAF bombers reached Berlin and dropped their loads on the capital of the Reich. The damage was minimal. The strategic consequences were enormous. In the end, the Battle of Britain was decided not by superior British tactics or technology, but by German pride and rage. Göring's promise created an expectation that couldn't be met. Hitler's fury at its breaking led to a strategic blunder, and Britain, battered but unbroken, survived to fight on. The sirens that wailed over Berlin that August night were more than a warning of falling bombs. They were the sound of German invincibility shattering, of a promise broken, of a war that would now take a very different course. The British had proven that Berlin could be reached, and in proving it, they had saved themselves.